with both The Shortest History of China and with Bombard, the headquarters, what I tried to do is to highlight as many Chinese perspectives as possible and to show how culture and politics are so joined in China, how you cannot separate culture from politics. And in both books, I tried to also highlight the stories of women as much as possible, because you can read some histories and you finish them and you're like, I wonder what the women were doing.
Yeah. The Chinese Cultural Revolution is one of the iconic events of the 20th century. It's a very complex event, but now there is a brilliant book, which in roughly over 100 pages will tell you the complete story of the Cultural Revolution. You could read it in a weekend. You could read it, if you click on the link in the video description below, in this weekend. And it's author Linda Jaivin. I caught up for a fascinating, lively, wonderful interview. Linda Jaivin is the author of more than 12 books, including The Shortest History of China. And she has been a foreign correspondent. She's studied Chinese language, history and culture for over 40 years and is an associate of the Australian Centre on China in the World. And you can also read about Linda Jaivin's Shortest History of China and Bombard, the headquarters, at my Substack at jeffrich.substack.com. She's a wonderful guest. I'm sure you'll enjoy this interview with Linda Jaivin. Welcome to the Burning Archive, Linda Jaivin.
Thank you so much, Jeff.
You've just published, or about to publish, I guess in the next day or so, Bombard, the headquarters to Cultural Revolution in China. I guess it's one of the iconic events of the 20th century. And your book is a brilliant 100-odd pages, wonderful, lively introduction. There are some books on the Cultural Revolution that are a lot longer than that. I wonder if we just start, though, with the cover image on, the first thing someone would see if they pick up the book in the bookshop, of this young woman fist pumping in the air. What's her story and what's how does it sort of represent the Cultural Revolution to you?
Well, I don't know exactly who she is. She has become one of the iconic images, but she represents the Cultural Revolution in so many ways. At least the beginning of it, where Mao, for his part, Chairman Mao, chairman of the Communist Party, had a lot of things on his mind. He had people who were really irritating him. He felt they were dragging back the revolution. They were taking his revolution, which needed to be continuous, which needed to be constantly churning. There had to be vigilance and struggle against new exploiting classes, or the return of the bourgeoisie and so on. And he had various enemies in the party at this point. So he had a lot of reasons for saying we need a complete cultural revolution. We need continuous revolution. And we need and he said, bombard the headquarters. He felt there was an alternative headquarters rising up that was against him, and the thing that happened that turned this from what might have been an internal power struggle, something happened within the party, to something that became a nationwide movement, was that the young people of China who were born, the generation that was born after the revolution, who was raised on heroic images, like that woman holding up her fist, that was, in propaganda posters, in films, and all of this, images of heroism during the anti-Japanese war, during the Civil War, the Long March, and so on. They had not had their chance to shine. And when they felt that Mao, their hero, was in danger, they themselves got together, a small group at first, got together in Beijing. It was in Beijing at first, one high school, and they very dramatically, very theatrically declared themselves to be the Red Guards. They would protect Mao. They would carry on his revolution. They would be his worthy successors, and they would create havoc in heaven, quoting a kind of a Ming Dynasty novel that Mao liked very much as well. These young people started a movement that was very seductive to young people. I mean, rebelling, what young person doesn't want to jump into that? Anyway, she represents that youthful energy, which Mao hadn't planned the Red Guards. He hadn't ordained the Red Guards. But once they formed themselves, he saw in them a really perfect way to carry out the revolution, to blood a new generation of successors. They were fantastic until they became less fantastic, and he had to tamp them down and send them off to the countryside. But yeah, so she represents to me that youthful energy, that youthful idealism, that determination, that and that command you can see in the background. There's a whole lot of people who are not necessarily students who are, listening to her. There was so much power that they held. That they commanded, that they took, and people were quite afraid of them for good reason. And you can kind of see this thing. There's also something interesting in that it was one of those rare moments in Chinese history where women really could take the stage as equals with men, the political stage.
Yeah, and we'll get to some of those striking women maybe later in the interview as well. But it's always struck me as one of the most fascinating things about the Cultural Revolution that is sometimes lost in when people talk about it is like an internal power struggle at the top of the Communist Party. But why are people pumping their fists in front of huge crowds and that sort of thing? I think that's one of the most fascinating things about it. The title of your book is Bombard the Headquarters, and in a way it's the story of that slogan, I guess, or that political philosophy even from Mao is a bit like what you said with the Red Guards. It's something he sort of picked up somehow, didn't he, from other people and
Oh, no.
used, or was it the other way around?
It's the other way around. But what had happened was on May 16th, 1966, the party did endorse Mao's call for cultural revolution. So that many historians debate, when did the Cultural Revolution start? Some say it kind of started in 1964, and other people say it started even earlier. So it depends on how you count, because Mao had been calling for a cultural revolution since the early 1960s. The party endorsed the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution on 16 May 1966, but Mao felt that they were still holding back. Now, there had been a party secretary in Peking University who had written what's called a great character poster. In other words, she'd taken brush and ink and written these characters very large on a piece of paper and posted it. That was a call to basically overthrow the academic authorities in her university and those who supported them for not taking seriously Mao's calls for people to educate themselves by letting the workers and peasants educate them, not taking book learning as the ultimate type of knowledge and so on. He really liked what she had done. And she kind of brought this form big character posters, which had appeared from time to time in the 20th century as a way of people expressing dissident political views. She had brought this into revolutionary China for the first time. Now, what he did was he was in a 5-day meeting with his colleagues in the leadership. He had the Cultural Revolution had started. The Red Guards were agitating on campus, dragging people out and criticizing them, and there was a lot going on. He went down to the south on a inspection tour. He often did that. When he was gone, a couple of other leaders, including the president, Liu Shaoqi, and the general secretary of the party, Deng Xiaoping, they had said, whoa, maybe we just need to calm things down on the campuses. So they sent in work teams, and these work teams talked to the students about maybe having a few limits, that kind of thing. Mao gets back. He hears about this when he's down south. He goes for a swim in the Yangtze to prove that at 73 years old, he's still virile, he's still strong, he's still capable of doing, remarkable things and leading. He comes back and he's in this meeting with his colleagues, and he's growing more and more furious to the point that he's actually yelling at the president who's sitting right next to him. At one point, on I think the 5th day, August 5th, he takes a Peking Daily that's just sitting on the table, and he, with a pencil, he scribbles some notes in the margin. He gives this to a secretary who tidies it up, gives it back to him, he re-edits it. It's then distributed first to the party leaders, and then it's made public. And it's called Bombard the Headquarters, my big character poster. Later propaganda posters would show Mao with a brush and ink, writing these words on a large white paper. It didn't happen that way. It was a scribble, but the meaning of it was, okay, the party is against me. The party is forming another kind of headquarters. It's pushing me out. Bombard the headquarters. It was his call on the people of China, his followers, everyone who loved him, and that was a lot of people, to then attack his enemies in the party.
And so this unleashes the first phase, I guess, of the Cultural Revolution.
I would say it was a kind of a turning point. It
a
did
turning point.
pump up like volume. It did, take away. It really gave people permission to do anything they could. It gave the whole thing a sense of absolute emergency, crisis.
Yep. And there's this slogan, "Smash the four olds," and I often wonder. I mean, sometimes I wonder how whether the English translations of some of these slogans are a little bit awkward somehow. I don't know, or whether they're that stilted in Chinese as well. But
it is kind of weird in Chinese, po si hai. It's like po si jiu. It's for olds. In Chinese you can actually collapse things, but it does not sound. It's not something you would say in conversation.
No.
It's definitely a political slogan. And that was about attacking all kinds of old culture, old habits, old traditions, and so on, ways of thinking, because Mao genuinely wanted to tear down the old society in every way so that society could be made afresh, so that you could create socialism, true socialism or true communism, which involved people's thinking. It involved the way they interacted. It involved absolutely every aspect of life. And so this was a call that was basically destroy the world we live in so that we can build something new.
And the destruction despite the heroism of the pose on the cover of the book, the destruction is really quite remarkable in this first. I guess both the violence towards people, but also the cultural destruction. Can you give us a sense of
Well,
how much smashing of the olds happened?
put it this way, if Chiang Kai-shek hadn't taken some 600,000 treasures of the Forbidden City over to Taiwan, considered a major crime by the communists at the time, who are quietly thankful for that now, then China would really be lacking in it would have destroyed most of its most precious cultural heritage. A lot of things you don't know if you've grown up in the mainland, or if you're a visitor, you don't know when you go into a temple, for example, that temple was smashed and rebuilt. There's nothing that tells you that. There's nothing that tells you that, for example, the Buddha that you're looking at in a historical temple, some of the Buddhas were protected, not many, but that you're looking at this Buddha, you don't know, for example, that it's actually newly made, or that it was salvaged from some rural temple that somehow it didn't get smashed. So it's invisible in a way because you can't see what's gone. There are so many precious manuscripts, artworks, books, and items that were smashed or burned either by people themselves out of fear that were they caught with them, they would be horrifically punished, or by the Red Guards. At some point, it got a little bit regularized, and the government's like, okay, just hand those things in if they look valuable. And the excuse at the time, as I write in the book, was that we need something. If we're going to keep criticizing old culture, we need a little bit of old culture around to criticize, or we won't know what we're criticizing. So some things were saved, but the amount of cultural destruction was unbelievable. It, like, the majority of, in a number of places, including Beijing, the majority of registered historical cultural artifacts were destroyed. It's so difficult to comprehend. It really is, and it's something that it's very hard to document or to perceive when you're in China.
One of the key figures in this is, and you'll have to correct my poor Chinese pronunciation, but Jiang Qing, yeah? Have I got that right? Yes. Mao's wife, and she's one of the key figures in the Cultural Revolution, and she's both encouraging the smashing of the old, but also constructing, I guess, a new proletarian culture.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about her, and why does she sort of dramatically come onto the stage of history at this particular moment?
Yes, a really good question. So she was she was raised in very difficult circumstances. Her father was very violent. Her mother ran away with her. Her father actually broke one of her teeth at one point with a spade. He was, so she did not come from wealth or privilege. She was very pretty. She ended up studying acting, getting to Shanghai, falling in with the communist movement there while acting in films. Mao, meanwhile, was married to his third wife. His first was an arranged marriage. His second wife was executed. And his third wife, He Zizhen, was a was a hero of the Long March, was a hero of the revolution. She was a warrior. By the time the Long March finished up in the 1930s and the communists were holed up in their mountainous stronghold of Yan'an, she had 17 bullet wounds. She had been really badly wounded. She had borne Mao 6 children, and I think they'd lost or been separated from 5 of them. So, she'd been through a lot, and she was quite stretched. And then Mao stretched her even further by having all kinds of affairs. So her colleagues, who respected her a lot, the people in the party, sent her to the Soviet Union for treatment for her various wounds and for everything else. Meanwhile, Mao is meeting all kinds of urban people who are they're making their way to this mountain stronghold to join the revolution, full of idealism. And one of them is this pretty young actress called Jiang Qing. Oh, she was actually called Lan Ping. We won't go into that. She had a number of different names. But she's the one we know her by is Jiang Qing. So he starts an affair with her, and he decides he's going to marry her. And this really upsets his colleagues. They don't like her. They think she's ambitious. They don't trust her commitment to the revolution, which is a mistake because she really was committed. And she really was ambitious. They weren't wrong about that. They resented the fact that Mao would have to divorce He Zizhen, who they respected, to marry Jiang Qing. So they're very much opposed to it. They finally agree on the condition that she stay out of politics for 30 years. Now, this is 1936-ish, right?
Oh, okay.
So now we fast forward to the 1960s. And she has been sort of biding her time. She's been working in a kind of a film capacity in the 1950s. In the 1960s, she starts getting together because she's very much invested in Mao's idea of smashing the old culture and rebuilding a new one. So she's very interested in how do you rebuild this new culture? What do we create to take the place of the old culture? And she works with composers and other actors and writers to create a series of work that are called in English revolutionary model operas, but they weren't all operas. There were ballets and there were symphonies, and the idea is that they are revolutionary and that they are model works. Model is quite crucial here. The same word that is used in this revolutionary model opera construction, Yangban, for model, is industrial model. In other words, something that is built to be replicated. So the idea was that you create these things that, for example, in traditional Peking opera, you might have emperors and beauties and scholars. And she said, we're going to get rid of those people. We're going to kick them off the stage and have China's true heroes on the stage, the workers, the peasants, the soldiers. And the revolutionaries are going to be the heroes. They're going to be new stories, while using some of the old opera's hand gestures and so on. There's stylistic aspects and bringing in a little bit of Western symphonic music and so on. She worked on these things, and they began to create a series of them. So she was already very much in this position when the Cultural Revolution began. And when I say model to replicate, I should just go back on that a little bit. They were created in a way that, for example, if I was a peasant, right, and my costume had a patch here and a patch here, then this was something that if it was performed in Beijing and it was performed in a little village by a propaganda troupe out in the Northwest, and it was produced somewhere in the Southwest, all of those peasant characters would have the patch here and the patch here. Everything was very clear, and they also she also oversaw the production of artworks that were similar. So there's a sculptural assembly which represents poor peasants um, speaking bitterness about the exploitation they had suffered under a landlord and criticizing the landlord, struggling the landlord. And that also was designed for exact replication. Um, so we get back to 1966, the Cultural Revolution. In February 1960, I think it was February 1966, she was made, I think she was put in charge of culture in the People's Liberation Army. From that moment, she began wearing an army uniform,
Mm.
and became that became one of the big fashions among the revolutionary youth in the Cultural Revolution. You know, but she wore it, um, and she was by Mao's side in many ways, even though their marriage was always a bit strained thanks to his constant philandering.
Yes.
And it eventually became, paper only. But she uh, she helped him draft various important documents and so on. But she became more and more active in the cultural sphere and then generally politically as the head of a group of ultra radicals who wanted to take this thing absolutely as far as they could, while certain other members of the leadership had qualms and they would say, maybe the army shouldn't do this, or, that kind of thing. But she was in the faction. She was the head of the faction that was very much for pushing as far and as fast as possible.
Mm. Mm. And is that the faction that becomes known as the Gang of Four
Yes,
ultimately, or yes.
that's the
Yeah,
faction Mao
yeah.
names the Gang of Four.
It was his term, wasn't it? Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, he was a
yeah,
little annoyed with
yeah.
them.
Yeah, I mean, I have, distant memories now, I guess, of seeing some of those model revolutionary operas from the early 1970s, and distant memories of watching the news about the Gang of Four and the end of the Cultural Revolution as well. But I guess the film, which I think you refer to in the book, but certainly you refer to in your other book, The Shortest History of China, Farewell, My Concubine, beautifully presents this sort of replacement of one culture by another, and then I guess ultimately its return as well. So after this first fervent phase of the Cultural Revolution, there's a sort of a period where it's sort of jostling for power, and I guess some attempts to restore order, perhaps. I guess in the period sort of broadly between 68 and 71, I understand. And one that I'm not sure if I'm quite following your chronology, but and one of the key figures there is Lin Biao. Can you give us a sense of what happens after this first burst of the Cultural Revolution and the sort of period leading up to the mysterious defection of Lin Bao?
I think it's interesting. There was always a bit of push and pull, represented right from the beginning with that thing I mentioned about work teams. So Mao's like, "Yay, chaos on the campuses," and they're like, "Oh, maybe we pull this back a little bit." And then Mao's like, "No, let it go." There was constantly a push and pull, including in the beginning of 1967, when the idea was that the army needed to get involved to empower when the various radicals, because the students were soon joined by workers and others, they began fighting among themselves. When there was when the split between Mao and President Liu Shaoqi became apparent, a lot of people became involved in, which faction do you support? So people began forming factions. The factions began to be involved in violent confrontations with one another, very violent. And in 1967, it was thought, well, let's let the army in and they can empower the faction that's the most radical left faction to then take over whatever local authority there is and establish a new authority. Now, the idea that the army should get involved was hugely controversial. And a lot of the old veteran army people in the leadership were like, we don't like this. The army shouldn't be involved. The army should not be involved in this factional stuff. In the end, it was decided the army will be involved. Now, at the time, the defense minister, the head of the army, was Lin Biao. Lin Biao had been very involved in the cultivation of Mao's personality cult. He was the editor of it was his idea to come up with the Little Red Book, which was it was a series of quotations from Mao's works. And I probably have one somewhere on the shelf behind me, I think.
I certainly remember one from my youth.
I do.
Everywhere back in the 70s, so everywhere. Yeah, there we go.
And they were designed, there were a lot of different versions, but they're basically designed so that they can fit into a soldier's pocket. Because he was the head of the army. And the plastic is because it had to be hard wearing. A soldier might be might be in the trenches. So that's the origin of the Little Red Book. Anyway, you have this constant push and pull between different ideas at factions in the leadership itself. There's factional fighting below. Things don't actually calm down. The students carry on, but things get a lot worse once the party decides that they're going to very early on that they are going to sanction what's called class, the cleansing of, they called it the cleansing of the class ranks. So Mao was always about class struggle, and this became sanctioned. This did not have to do with the Red Guards. There's a lot of misapprehension because a lot of the photos or images that we're aware of from the Cultural Revolution that have survived, that kind of have burnt into our collective memory, are all about struggle sessions where Red Guards have people bent over in stressed positions, beating them, interrogating them, and so on, or burning books. But some of the worst violence of the Cultural Revolution took place in the countryside away from the cameras, where local cadres and radical cadres and others got together and made literally kill lists. So anybody whose grandfather had once been a landlord, even if they'd been tilling the land like a poor peasant ever since their granddad had been disappropriated of his land in the early 50s or 40s, if you had a class background that was capitalist or landlord, or if you had been labeled, or somebody in your family had been labeled a rightist during the 1958 campaign against rightism, if you were a class enemy, you could be put on these kill lists. Over the years of the class warfare in the countryside, not warfare, it was one-sided, of the cleansing, of the extermination of class enemies, more than 71,000 families were wiped out in their entirety. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed in organized attacks. Old men and babies and women and everybody people could be thrown over cliffs, blown up with dynamite, stabbed to death. There were all kinds of horrific ways in which they could be cleansed. So this was going on. The Red Guards had been going crazy. Mao finally got sick of the Red Guard violence. It was just a bit out of control and not really any longer to the doing what he had hoped, what he had wanted to do, or what he had wanted to do had been done. And therefore, calm down, kids.
Move on.
Yeah, time to move on. So we moved them on to the countryside to be re-educated by the peasants. A lot of people who had been criticized and all of that in institutions from the People's Daily to the Academy of Sciences and Peking University and all that. A lot of people were moved for short periods of time, ranging from, say, a couple of months to a couple of years, to the countryside to be re-educated by the peasants again. The kids were sent supposedly for life. These people were still given their salaries and they would be coming back eventually. So there was this huge shift of what was going on. And the killings continued. And there were various campaigns, new campaigns that kept coming up, whether it was about a conspiracy in Inner Mongolia, which was completely fake, but ended up with so many people being beaten and imprisoned and killed. This sort of thing kept going on. Now, back to your point, 1971. Mao has always called Lin Biao his closest comrade in arms, and he's his chosen successor. But by 1971, he's suspecting that Lin Biao is a bit too ambitious. And he's ambitious not just for himself, but for his son, who he calls a super genius. Now, Lin Li Guo was a known sexual harasser and Beatles fan, which is a kind of an odd. Sometimes rock and rollers would say, if they'd actually carried out their coup, I wonder if we'd gotten the Beatles, earlier. But Mao began to be very annoyed and distrustful of Lin Biao and his son, and and this became quite clear. He became critical of them within the leadership. The top leadership, people were sensing the tension. They were figuring this out. Nobody in the masses knew this at all, because it was very much in this sealed room. And then, and we'll never know the whole story, but basically Mao decided that Lin Biao was trying to kill him. Lin Biao gets word, who knows what? We'll never know, right? All these people are now gone. But Lin Biao, his wife, and his son, who had been reading up on a Russian language and some other things, they raced to a local military airport. They jumped in a plane. They took off so fast they didn't even have time to collect their co-pilot. They went so fast, they clipped the wing a little bit on a truck that was on the runway, took off, and we don't know why. Possibly lack of petrol, who knows. They crashed over Mongolia and everyone died. That was a huge turning point in the whole Cultural Revolution because, okay, it's 1971. People have been through a lot. A lot of people are beginning to get disillusioned. The young people are off in the countryside. They're like, wait, what? What just happened? They're reading everything they can get a hold of. They're wondering what they did. There's a lot of stuff going on. And the news comes out finally that Lin Biao has died. People begin to notice that he's gone. A couple of people in jail who've written memoirs wrote that one day the guards came and took away their little red books and their things like that, and then returned them, and Lin Biao's preface had been pulled out. It's like, it was announced that Lin Biao had been trying to assassinate Mao and that he had died in this plane crash. And that was a turning point for a lot of people who went, wait a minute, Mao is supposed to be this amazingly infallible leader. How could he have trusted a man who then turned out to be so bad? And there was this huge discussion in the leadership. Do we call him an ultra rightist or an ultra leftist? And so all of that kind made a lot of people at that point pull back.
Mm.
And obviously, there were 5 more years of Cultural Revolution to go through. There was a lot more killing, a lot more pain, a lot more sacrifice. But there was also a turning point in the general willingness of the population to buy into what was being sold to them.
Mm.
And the following year, after Lin Biao's death, Nixon comes to China, the
Yes.
president of the nation that's the great Satan, down
Yeah.
with American imperialism. So
Yeah.
all of this had to be processed,
Yeah.
and it did cause the kind of confusion that meant that that sort of ideological certainty could not continue.
Mm. Mm. And that story of, Nixon going to China is often told from the American perspective and the,
Yeah.
preternatural genius of Henry Kissinger. But it's even more puzzling in a way amidst all this chaos, like the Chinese side of the story is even more puzzling in many ways. But maybe that's a whole other conversation. The period of just sort of winding down of the Cultural Revolution, the struggle between the Gang of Four and to some extent Deng Xiaoping is he's sort of back and then he's out and he's back and he's out, and it's this sort of complex story. How does the sort of Cultural Revolution come to an end, and is it just I guess it's both a succession crisis, but it's also, I guess, people starting to come to terms with, well, what have we done? A bit like what you're saying. People are saying, what have we just been through?
Well, on the popular level, it's definitely happening that they're going, what have we been through? Young people are beginning to force their ways back into the cities, erect shanty towns, and demonstrate and demand their permission to reside in the cities be given back to them. People are beginning to openly. There's some open dissent. Dissenters never come to a good end in the Cultural Revolution, but there's a certain kind of underground hero thing going on. There's a lot of dissatisfaction. Women who have lost husbands revive an ancient custom of going to the house of the person or the office of the person who wronged them, who committed this misdeed, and just wailing, just like howling and wailing. All these things are happening. So there's definitely dissatisfaction below. On the top level, we have a lot of people who now really, really they've disagreed with the ultra radical line. There is now this sense of different factions. Mao himself is becoming more and more ill with Lou Gehrig's disease, heart issues, and everything else. And he's the last time he actually speaks at a conference, he has to have an oxygen. He has to have equipment for oxygen at the podium. He is becoming more and more gnomic in his pronouncements. Nobody really. He's playing one side off the other, but he's also more and more inaccessible to his own people, who have to go through. Even his wife has to go through one of his former train attendants, a woman who is now his carer, a young woman. So things are falling apart on the bottom, and they're falling apart at the top. And there really is a sense that Mao's days are limited, and the struggle is becoming more intense. Zhou Enlai, who was very much involved in the whole thing with the Americans and so on. And by the way, the Chinese and the Americans shared a very important goal. And this is kind of the key to how this all happened. And that was neither wanted the other to be allied with the Soviet Union. They both were very worried about the Soviet Union. America's worst nightmare was a Chinese-Soviet Union realliance. And China's worst nightmare was the United States and the Soviets getting together to completely encircle China, from Vietnam through to the bases in the Philippines and Japan and Korea. Then you've got the Soviet Union and its ally, India. So China and the US both had real investment in making sure the other one, that they were friendly enough that the other would not get together with the Soviet Union. So Zhou Enlai, who's behind this, he and the Gang of Four are completely at loggerheads, but Zhou himself is very ill. And Zhou dies in 1975. This is a turning point. He dies early in 1975, and the people are genuinely distressed because they believe, and I go into the book why this might not be entirely, their information might not be entirely accurate, but they believe that he has constantly done everything he can to mitigate the effects of the Cultural Revolution, to protect certain people and certain places from total destruction, which he did do. And that he was, if there's a hero in all of this, if there's somebody who actually did try to keep Mao from destroying everything, it was Zhou Enlai. When he died, Mao's still alive, but he's really, he's very ill. He's barely talking. Zhou dies, and the people just go into obvious huge mourning. The Gang of Four prohibits this mourning because they see this as an anti-them thing. They read the room. They say you can't wear the black armbands. There's be no wreaths, etc. The people are like, yeah, screw that. And it all culminates in a huge demonstration in early April on Tiananmen Square. And they clash with the military, which is sent in to suppress the demonstration. But before they're suppressed, they read poems that are really clearly anti-Jiangqing, anti-Gang of Four, and a little more subtly anti-Mao. They read poems of mourning for Zhou, but also what they believe he stood for. This is a really big turning point because it was the first mass demonstration in China since the Cultural Revolution began that was not about protecting the Cultural Revolution and furthering it. This was about putting brakes on it. So that was highly significant. And of course, it was suppressed, but it was a turning point. There was two things that happened that are traditional signs that a dynasty is about to fall because it's lost the mandate of heaven. One is a comet shower, and one of those occurred. And another one, people thought it was an attack from the Soviet Union at first when the sky kind of began to light up with these explosions, cosmic explosions. The other one was an earthquake, major earthquake in the summer of 76. So just months after Zhou died, that killed hundreds of thousands of people in a city very close to Beijing and shook Beijing. So all of this is happening. Mao dies on September 9th, 1976. And immediately, even on his deathbed, there was a whole jockeying for who gets to be there and who's really the successor. Because once Lin Biao was gone, it wasn't actually very clear who was supposed to succeed him. And Jiang Qing believed it should be her, but others did not. And in the end, it was Hua Guofeng who, and that's a whole nother story. We don't need to go into that here. But Hua Guofeng, who had been various things, including, I think, Minister for Security, he, with a number of other leaders, secretly planned this a month after Mao's death in October 1976. They called the Gang of Four for an evening meeting to discuss the editing of the 5th volume of Mao Zedong's collected works. And of course, that's the moment that they staged the arrests of the four, 2 of them at home and 2 of them when they walked into the meeting. So that formally brought an end to the Cultural Revolution. They announced it was over. There was a huge movement, propaganda movement to criticize the Gang of Four, and a lot of Chinese people criticized the Gang of Four with very wholeheartedly, but said criticize the Gang of Four because they're without Mao, the Gang of Four would have been nothing.
Mm. Mm.
So they would hold up five
So
fingers.
really talking about a gang of five, yeah. And
Now,
then there's a sort of a show trial and the Gang of
yeah,
Four,
show trial.
and perhaps particularly Zhang Qing, just to return to her story, is sort of almost made, I guess, the scapegoat, I guess, for
Yeah,
the event in some ways, or
well, she's a scapegoat because the woman always takes the blame.
yeah.
Chinese in China, they have a saying that says, "A woman in power is as natural as a hen crowing at dawn," and that's always been used to criticize empress, women who have taken power. Very few of them have been able to, but. In 1981, the Communist Party issues a document that declares the Cultural Revolution a catastrophe, acknowledges Mao made mistakes, but then says he was bamboozled by counter-revolutionaries, which is probably the worst insult you could ever aim at Jiang Qing and her gang. They are put on trial, as are some of the supporters, people around Lin Biao. But most of the people who committed crimes and murders, who did terrible things in the Cultural Revolution, were never called to account, never be brought to trial. This show trial did a couple of things. It said, okay, once we put these people away, we're done. Everybody should move on. It also significantly gave the message that from now on, justice is not about mob justice. It's about process, legal process. So we're no longer, it wasn't putting Jiang Qing up in front of a struggle session and letting the mob do what they would. It was putting her in front of a court where she famously called the judge a fascist and said, "I was Mao's dog. I bit whoever he told me to bite." She was defiant to the end.
Yeah. And I guess that takes us in a way to, I guess, the way in which people are processing the memory, the very traumatic memory. Maybe a lot of people just kind of want to forget, perhaps, the Cultural Revolution for both good and bad reasons. You can understand after such an extraordinary trauma, maybe wanting to move on in your life. But also the way the different histories of this Cultural Revolution are told. How are the different versions of the Cultural Revolution told? Maybe particularly China versus the West, because there's a lot of propaganda and there's a lot of politically loaded commentary one way or the other around those issues these days. How can a general reader kind of work their way through all the maze of different perspectives on the Cultural Revolution?
Well, I think it's really important to read Chinese perspectives. It's also really important to read good, solid work on it. And I have in my Bombard, the headquarters, I have a good bibliography and suggested further reading and viewing, including of the documentary Morning Sun and so on. So if you look at that, you can see a lot of the great work that's been done by scholars. I mean, my book, I sit on their shoulders, and now there were a lot of memoirs that have come out, but some have come out in Chinese, some have not been able to come out in China. It doesn't make them less valuable or less Chinese, in their perspective. They do tend to be victim memoirs, but there was also a lot of victim, what they called scar literature that came out, where people talked about their experiences and so on in the early 80s. And then the government was like, okay, enough, move on. People have processed it in many different ways, because the government has slowly, and under Xi Jinping, fastly clamped down on examination, self-examination, discussion, and so on of the Cultural Revolution. And the archives have been slowly, shut. The view of it is quite limited, quite censored in China, and has given way in the popular arena, I suppose, to a kind of a confused nostalgia, a nostalgia for a more innocent time, supposedly.
Mm.
I mean, that's the thing. Like, if you want to show that cover again of my book, I
Mm.
think you have it handier than I do at
Yeah,
this point.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
Hang on.
the
I'll just and then we'll
Yeah,
go.
we look at
Yeah.
that, and doesn't that look, like, amazing? It looks so innocent, it looks so pure, it looks so
I know.
exciting, you know? And I think
Yeah.
that that kind of imagery has created a false sense in China. 2 years ago, thousands of young people marched, in Mao's birthplace, I think on his birthday, and they were like, "To rebel is justified," which was a
Mm.
Cultural Revolution slogan. Bring back the Cultural Revolution. And they're responding to situations of incredible inequality in society
Mm.
today
Mm.
between rich and poor and urban areas and rural areas and so on. The inequality and the privilege that some people have from wealth or power is so oppressive to people who don't have it. And it's so glaringly opposite to what the Communist Party ideals are, you know.
Mm.
Mao was responding in ways to inequalities and to things like that when he launched the Cultural Revolution. So a lot of its slogans and its imagery and its and what it was supposed to be about relate to these issues. And these young people are like, yeah, corruption, inequality, you know. And we young people, I mean, 20, who knows, because they stopped publishing the statistics, but at least 20% of urban young people are unemployed.
Mm.
Um, the government's telling young people to go work in the countryside, you know, or to work in a I mean, it's educated young people, you know.
Mm.
Um, there's a lot of issues. People are burnt out by the hybrid capitalist culture that has resulted in such things as what they call 996, which is working 9 to 9, 6 days a week, which is the norm in tech companies. A lot of
Mm.
young people prefer to work in the public service, which gives you much less money but is regular hours. So there's all sorts of things that have been going on in society that have taken these images, these limited images and this limited information, right? And made it into something that looks quite good,
Mm.
you know, quite
Mm.
just,
Mm.
quite empowering. And they've embraced it. I think last year, Mao's collected works made it into the number 20, like 1 to 20 bestseller lists.
Mm. Mm.
So, you know, pretty much watch this space.
Mm. Yeah.
But it is interesting because when you suppress full information on a subject, when you close the archives, when you don't allow people to discuss things openly and fully, you do create this strange situation where partial knowledge can become the source of desire and of I suppose, political inspiration.
Thing about history is, people keep rewriting it, don't they? And for good and bad reasons. And one of the things I really loved about your book, and also your book, The Short History of China, was or the shortest history of China, was the angle into it is partly through culture and literature rather than the sort of state old stories about politics and empires and all that kind of thing. And I just
In
think that
China, they're all
is.
so connected.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But also in this environment, some people talk about a new Cold War. I guess engaging more deeply with the culture of China, I guess, is also one way to, I just, help you, come to your own conclusions about what's really
Totally.
happening rather than just, receive propaganda.
Yeah. I mean, with both the shortest history of China, if I were a proper author, I would have had all this arranged on my bookshelves, which would be a lot neater.
That's okay. I'll put images in for you.
But with both the shortest history of China and with Bombard, the headquarters, what I tried to do is show you to highlight as many Chinese perspectives as possible and to show how culture and politics are so joined in China, how you cannot separate culture from politics. And in both books, I tried to also highlight the stories of women as much as possible, because you know you can read some histories and you finish them and you're like, I wonder what the women were doing.
Yeah, that's right. Indeed, indeed. And, well, we've talked about one of those most prominent women of the Cultural Revolution today, is Ching. Well, it's been a wonderful conversation, Linda. Thank you so
You?
much, and I highly
I've enjoyed
recommend.
it, Jeff. Thank you.
Yeah, I highly recommend people do check out Bombard the headquarters, and there'll be links in the video description below. I've also will have links to a couple of those documentaries
Oh, yeah, good.
you mentioned as well, which are available on YouTube, the wonderful resource of YouTube. But best of luck with the book, Linda, and
Thank
thank you
you.
so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. That's been really fun. Thank you.